Great. Uh, so basically, to give you some context around the course that I was teaching, this was what we call a junior writing seminar within the School of Communication. Basically, the way that it works is every junior needs to take a class that has a final outcome of a 20-page research paper. These courses are capped at 16 students, so it's a small seminar-style environment. And the way that I set it up is I alternated between content on Tuesday meetings and writing activities on Thursday meetings in order to balance sort of the broader focus of the course. Because it is a history of mass media influence, that final paper is focused on students sort of developing a history of a given social issue that is of interest to them through the lens of mass media. And that final outcome is scaffolded across a couple of assignments, specifically like a shorter writing assignment to develop a social issue of interest, a proposal, and then a literature review. So this was actually the second time that I taught my course. I first taught it over Zoom in winter of 2021. And, I feel like all the students had a lot of great progress. Most of them had not written anything like this before. So it was great to see the kind of growth that they had. But I noticed there was a lot of variation in the rates of progress and the final paper quality. So I started to wonder, because of the challenges of sort of coordinating group work and collaboration over Zoom, whether using this in-person class to increase the amount of collaboration might improve learner outcomes. So in terms of variables of interest, when I was conducting my literature review, there were two things that really stood out to being essential to the student learning process. One of which is self-efficacy, like Emma discussed just a second ago. Basically, this idea that students have their belief in their ability to produce a particular outcome, in this case, to write academically. The dimensions of self-efficacy that we're concerned about are enactive mastery, basically being able to do a thing in order to do it better. Vicarious experience, or the opportunity to sort of learn by observing others and working with other people, and also social persuasion, this idea that there is support and encouragement coming from all sides within the classroom. And similarly, well, I guess that is a sign of individual growth from my assessment. How are students developing as individuals? But in terms of that social persuasion, that can be sort of met through the process of developing a psychological sense of community. Basically, this idea that students feel like they belong and have support within a group. Dimensions of this tend to be emotional connection, opportunities for involvement, and opportunities for influence. So how can they get involved with their own writing process and their learning, as well as how can they affect others? And this is a measure of collective growth, thinking about how this small community of students is working together. And so the three research questions that I wanted to tackle through this project were, can participation in these collaborative writing workshops that I'm going to talk about in just a moment increase academic writing self-efficacy? Can they increase that sense of community? And finally, is there a relationship between that self-efficacy and their final paper outcomes that is going to be mediated by that sense of community? How does community fit into that process? So in terms of the design of the intervention itself, I held 4 collaborative writing workshops across the quarter. Every Thursday was dedicated to some form of writing activity, peer review, et cetera. But these workshops were more specifically designed to create collaboration in the form of discussion and feedback and other sort of active learning activities. In week 1, we focused on reflection and goal setting, starting with a big group discussion about some insights they could take away from their past experiences with writing. And also, I had them identify a strength and a weakness, and also actions they might take in the future, which I'll talk about in just a second, in order to sort of guide their learning process through the quarter to help them learn to become self-regulated learners. In workshop number 2, we focused on refining their topic. And this started with a sort of social issue of interest paper peer review discussion, and then a mind mapping activity where students worked with a partner to develop a mind map and to continue to expand their understanding of that social issue. In workshop number 3, we focused on maximizing the efficacy of peer review, thinking about first peer review strategies that we can use in order to provide feedback in a helpful manner, and also an in-class peer review activity focusing on what was their final paper proposal at this point. And then finally, we had our paper presentations in the last week, and following that, we had a larger group discussion about the big takeaways and growth that they experienced within the course. And so after each of these workshops, I had them complete a questionnaire. The questionnaire began with the same questions with slight modifications as time went on, where they identified both a strong element of their academic writing and a weakness, like I mentioned, as well as describing some ways in which they might utilize that strength in order to help other classmates with their writing activities, as well as how they might seek assistance from other people to help improve upon their weakness. So in weeks 4, 6, and 10, we focused on what kind of actions had been taken as opposed to might they take, and generally reflecting back on whether they had made progress in terms of their strength and their understanding of it, and the same thing with that weakness. Similarly, after that, they completed 2 quantitative measures. One for self-efficacy, you can see as a 7-point Likert type scale over here on the left, focused on their sort of beliefs about their ability to write academically. And then also a 5-point Likert type scale over here, focused on sense of community, how they feel like they fit in the classroom, how the classroom collaborates, and so on. And so because of the data collection process, I've not been able to dig into the qualitative findings as deeply as I might have liked to do a sort of thematic analysis, but I'm able to offer some impressions that I found from reviewing their strength, weakness, and action information, as well as their reflections across the subsequent weeks. So in terms of their week 1 reflections, the strengths that students identified tended to fall in these kinds of categories. As you can see on the left, editing, idea generation, argumentation processes, synthesizing ideas, organization, and also authorial voice, or that sense of clarity when they are writing. And if you look at the action column that you can see along the right side of each of those actually ended up lining up pretty nicely in terms of the actions that individuals thought that they would use to use their strength to help others, as well as the actions that individuals would take in order to help improve upon that weakness. They would seek out assistance with their editing during the proofreading phase. They might try and work on flexibility by talking with others about other ways to conceive of their ideas or how to approach a problem. And so there was a really nice balance between what people needed assistance with and what people were willing and able to assist with, which I think boded pretty well for the experience of the course overall. And then across those next 3 data points, we kind of saw a narrative emerging for most students that was fairly consistent. In week 4, they felt largely that their experiences in terms of writing assignments and discussions reaffirmed their strengths. I understood better how I was able to do this because of the activities that we undertook. They generally also felt that the activities and the strategies that were provided were helpful for addressing those weaknesses. But at week 4, only about half of the students reported actually taking an action to either help others or receive assistance. In week 6, their reflections started to express some growing pains. Some students started to question whether they were as strong in their strength as they thought they were previously. Other people were like, I feel like I'm discovering some new strengths through this class. And others still questioned whether they actually had any business reporting, which was a little heartbreaking for me. But in general, most students had positive growth at this point. And again, most of those students also reported having taken outside growth activities. So they had gone to the writing place at Northwestern to get assistance. They had worked with classmates outside of class to get feedback on part of their assignment. And then finally, in week 10, pretty universally, students expressed a sense of achievement in terms of their growth for both their strength and their weakness. Some of them expressed they still had some distance to go, but they now had a better idea of how to get to where they wanted to be. Most students indicated that they also felt more confident in their writing overall, or that they disliked the writing process less, because a lot of people in that first discussion that we had expressed, I really don't like writing that much, I don't feel comfortable with it, and so on. And so many attributed it to this class and the activities. So in terms of the quantitative findings, I conducted some repeated measures ANOVAs for RQ1 and RQ2. So basically across these 4 data points, was there significant change? I was not able to, in sort of overly complicated statistical terms, to meet the assumption of sphericity in my data. So I had to use the Greenhouse-Geiser correction, which was a slightly more conservative estimate of the impact of this experience. But we did find a significant, though almost borderline, impact on self-efficacy throughout this process. However, the partial eta squared we see here is actually indicative of a fairly large effect. So even though we see the mean score go from slightly under 6 to closer to 6.5, that is still a notable change within the grand scheme of my sample. Thinking about sense of community, this one we actually had a very significant impact. So all this collaboration did, as one might expect, actually improve the feelings of community that they felt within the course. And the partial eta squared in this case was also very, very large. And comparing week 1 against all the other weeks, we did find significant change from then. So pretty much from the first class to the 4th, we were able to create that sense of community pretty strongly. And then finally, I wanted to consider a mediation analysis for research question number 3. So I used process, the model 4, which is a simple mediation, in order to figure out sort of how these relationships between self-efficacy, sense of community, and their final paper scores worked out. In terms of self-efficacy, we do find a significant effect on both sense of community and final paper scores. That is, students who felt more confident about their writing tended to feel a stronger sense of community, and they tended to have better scores overall. And looking at the R-squared for both of these, that is not an insignificant impact. About 28% of the variance in those sense of community ratings was coming from self-efficacy, and about 51% of those final paper score variance was coming from their self-efficacy as well. However, when we look at the role played by sense of community, we actually find that it doesn't have much of an impact on that final paper outcome. So basically, we find that there's no indirect effect through sense of community, and that sense of community doesn't actually impact those final outcomes, but that self-efficacy does play a large role in sort of determining how those final paper scores shake out. So thinking about the limitations and conclusions of this particular study, the biggest limitation by far is the sample size. There are only 16 students in this class, so a lot of the assumptions of normality that happen with samples larger than 30 can't be assumed. Also, because these were largely self-report measures, there were concerns about the elevated ratings. Some students felt very confident from the start. They gave 7s across the board for self-efficacy. And while that is lovely to see, it's hard to know if that is a sincere feeling or if that is perhaps something that they wanted me to see in terms of desirability bias. So self-report measures are obviously not perfect, but it was nice to see through those reflections that there probably was some credence to the idea that these workshops did help improve their experience within the course and their self-efficacy. Additionally, because it's a correlational design, there is nothing we can really infer about causality here. Additionally, the frequency of the data collection does make it that there's potentially like a salience bias happening. Because we're asking students to think about self-efficacy and sense of community more frequently, it's possible that these same findings would not be found in designs that are more focused on not reflecting. They're just kind of taking things naturally. Additionally, with terms of those final paper scores, it is a very subjective grading process. Because I am the one grading these papers, I've developed a rubric, of course, but obviously the assessment of writing quality is something that's being determined by one person. It doesn't have the sort of quantitative heft of something more numeric. However, I do think that from this experience, we can take away some noteworthy conclusions. One is about this link between self-efficacy and sense of community. Because it's a correlational design, it is actually possible that it is the sense of community that influences self-efficacy positively. And I think that makes more sort of face value sense, that students who felt a better sense of community in the classroom actually did feel more efficacious in terms of their writing. It's also noteworthy how highly correlated self-efficacy was with student success. This should be fairly unsurprising given the broad amount of literature about this, but I thought it was noteworthy even within such a small sample, we were able to find this kind of evidence. And finally, students in their reflections really did appreciate the reflections themselves as a way to manage their own growth. This idea of developing self-regulated learners by asking them to think about their own growth processes. I was not regularly conducting individual conversations or group conversations about that growth. It was largely coming through their own reflections. So I think there is plenty of value in incorporating this kind of process into these writing experiences, because I think students really do benefit from the opportunities to have both that feeling of closeness with their classmates and also the ability to track their growth over time. So thank you so much for allowing me to present, and I'm curious to hear what kind of questions you have.